Ida for not wanting to do anything for my ex's unborn child? I was 24, a young man juggling the pressures of adulthood and fatherhood, already weathered by the storm of a failed relationship with Haley, the mother of my son. Our son, the innocent thread that tied us together, was only 5, far too young to understand the complexities of adult struggles. My relationship with Haley had been rocky even before we decided to call it quits 3 years ago. No matter how hard I tried, I felt like I could never measure up to her expectations. It wasn't as if I didn't want to. In fact, I bent over backward trying to be the man, the partner, and the father she wanted me to be. But with every step forward, I felt as if I was falling 2 steps back. Haley had insisted on being a stay-at-home mom to focus on raising our son. I respected her decision and worked myself to the bone to provide for our family. I took extra shifts, stayed late at work, and chased every opportunity to ensure we had what we needed. Yet, instead of appreciation, my late hours became a weapon she wielded against me. She accused me of deliberately keeping her at home, of abandoning her and our son for the sake of my job. The irony didn't escape me. Every extra hour I put in was for them, to support her choice to stay home, to give her the freedom to focus on our son. And yet, my sacrifices were seen as selfishness, a deliberate attempt to control her life. When I tried to spend time with our son, the accusations shifted. If I took him for the day, she claimed I was coming between them, sowing division between mother and child. If I spaced my time with him throughout the day, she said I wasn't involved enough, that I was more interested in being a part-time dad. Nothing I did seemed to strike the right balance. Every action felt scrutinized, twisted into something it wasn't. Even mundane tasks turned into battles. Haley didn't like my cooking but grew frustrated if I didn't make enough food. She complained when I packed lunches if I made one for her. She'd be annoyed at the gesture, but if I made one just for myself, she called me selfish. The contradictions were maddening, a constant tightrope walk where the lines blurred and shifted underfoot. It was as if I was always wrong, no matter what I did. Her frustrations extended beyond the home. If she wanted to go out with friends, I was expected to handle our son and still make it to work the next morning, regardless of how exhausted I might be. She often reminded me that a single parent wouldn't have the luxury of rest and that I needed to step up. Yet, if she had somewhere to be in the morning, she made it clear that I had to be present and ready to take over. My long hours and sleepless nights didn't matter. To her, they were just excuses, evidence of my supposed inadequacy. Her critiques didn't stop there. Haley often demanded I spend more time with her family, despite the hostile environment they created for me. She had a knack for spinning stories, painting me as the villain. If I fed or played with our son, her family saw it as me taking the baby away from his mother. If I wasn't actively working at that exact moment, they labeled me a lazy bum who was forcing their poor daughter to bear the burden of work. It was a lose-lose situation. Their judgmental glares and cutting remarks weighed heavily on me, deepening the chasm between Haley and me. Her family hated me, and she seemed to relish in fanning the flames. The resentment between us grew, a toxic cloud that hung over every interaction. I felt trapped in a no-win scenario, constantly undermined and unappreciated. The love that had once bound us together was long gone, replaced by bitterness and blame. It wasn't healthy for me, for Haley, or for our son. The breaking point was inevitable. When I finally ended things, it was like stepping out into fresh air after being suffocated for far too long. But freedom came at a cost. Haley's family, who had long despised me, were all too eager to celebrate the end of our relationship. They made no secret of their joy, openly declaring that Haley could do so much better than me. Their words stung, even though I tried not to let them show it. I wasn't perfect, but I had tried so hard to make things work, to be the man and father my family needed. To hear them dismiss me so easily, to label me a failure, was a painful reminder of how little my efforts had meant to them. The breakup didn't solve everything. Haley and I still shared custody of our son, a bond that kept us tethered despite the animosity. The challenges of co-parenting were just beginning, and I knew the road ahead would be anything but smooth. Yet, even as I faced the uncertainty of the future, I held on to one truth: I had done what I believed was right for myself and my son. I could only hope that one day, he would understand the choices I made and see that every sacrifice, every struggle, had been for him. Breaking up with Haley was meant to be the end of the toxicity, a way to salvage what little remained of my sanity and ensure I could be a present and capable father for my son. But in reality, it was only the beginning of a new kind of chaos. While the relationship was officially over, the battles it birthed lingered on, dragging me back into the turmoil I was so desperate to escape. Her family, emboldened by the separation, wasted no time reminding me how much of a failure I was. Their comments became sharper, their disdain more overt. They paraded their relief as though Haley had escaped a sinking ship, and I was the anchor dragging her down. It wasn't enough that we were no longer together, they needed to tear me down further, stripping away whatever respect or dignity I had left. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I told myself their opinions didn't matter. What mattered was my son, his well-being, and my ability to remain in his life. Yet, even that became a battleground. A few months after the breakup, Haley began dating someone new. At first, I told myself it didn't concern me. Her personal life was her own business, and as long as our son was unaffected, I had no reason to get involved. But it wasn't long before the lines blurred, and her relationship began to encroach on my role as a father. Haley's new boyfriend seemed to be a fixture in their lives almost immediately, and I could sense her testing the boundaries of our custody agreement. She started canceling or rescheduling my time with our son at the last minute, always with flimsy excuses. Sometimes it was that he wasn't feeling well, other times it was because they had family plans. The word family stung when she used it in that context, as though I had been replaced, as though I no longer had a place in my son's life. The tipping point came when Haley made her intentions clear: she wanted me out of the picture entirely. She filed for sole custody, claiming that I was an unfit father who didn't deserve to be a part of our son's life. The accusations were baseless but brutal. She painted a picture of me as neglectful, irresponsible, and emotionally unstable, spinning a narrative that aligned perfectly with her family's long-standing grievances against me. Her family, of course, rallied behind her, submitting statements to the court about my supposed poor character and negative influence on my son. They spoke as though they had witnessed some kind of moral failing, conveniently ignoring the years I spent working myself to exhaustion to support Haley and our child. The custody battle was one of the darkest periods of my life. The fear of losing my son was suffocating, and the weight of her allegations was a constant burden. I worried endlessly about how it might affect the judge's decision, about the possibility of my son growing up without me in his life. But the truth, as painful as it was on my side. I had done nothing to warrant losing custody, and the evidence or lack thereof reflected that. The judge's ruling was a moment of vindication, though it came at the cost of more emotional exhaustion than I could have imagined. Haley's attempts to strip me of my rights were denied, and the court maintained the 50-50 custody arrangement. I'll never forget the judge's words to her: "If you wanted a different father for your son, you should have chosen one." It was a small victory, but it felt monumental in the face of everything she had thrown at me. Still, Haley didn't take the loss gracefully. Her resentment toward me deepened, and her attempts to undermine my relationship with our son continued. She wasn't content with shared custody, and she made it clear in ways both subtle and overt. The presence of her boyfriend only seemed to escalate the tension. He inserted himself into situations where he had no business being, often trying to act as though he had some authority over my son or over me. The threats started small, veiled in condescension and smug superiority. At first, they were easy to brush off. But it wasn't long before they escalated into something more tangible, more dangerous. Twice, Haley's boyfriend showed up at my door, spewing threats and trying to intimidate me. The first time, I didn't take it as seriously as I should have. I told him to leave and reported the incident to the police, but without evidence, there was little they could do beyond issuing a warning. The second time was different. By then, I had learned to expect the unexpected, to be prepared for whatever new obstacle Haley or her boyfriend might throw my way. When he appeared on my doorstep again, his words laced with aggression, I was ready. I recorded the entire interaction, capturing every threat and every insult. This time, when I reported him to the police, the evidence was irrefutable. The warning he received wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a serious wake-up call that made it clear there would be consequences if he ever tried something like that again. For a while, things seemed to settle. Haley's boyfriend backed off, likely realizing that I wasn't as easy a target as he had assumed. But the damage had already been done. The entire ordeal left me on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next wave of drama would hit. It was exhausting, but I knew I couldn't afford to let my guard down. I had to remain steady, not just for myself, but for my son. Through it all, my focus remained on him. Despite the chaos and the constant tug-of-war, I did my best to shield him from the negativity. I wanted his childhood to be as normal as possible, free from the weight of adult conflicts. Every moment I spent with him reminded me why I was fighting so hard, why I refused to let Haley or anyone else take away my role in his life. He deserved a father who was present, who loved him unconditionally, who would fight for him no matter the odds. And I was determined to be that father, no matter how many battles I had to face. The news of Haley's pregnancy hit me like a wave I hadn't seen coming. For the first few months after she and her boyfriend broke up, I barely heard from her outside of what was necessary to coordinate custody for our son. It was a strange and almost peaceful silence, one I dared not trust, given the volatility of our past. But then, one day, the silence was shattered by a text from her. Not about our son, not about visitation or schedules, but about something entirely unexpected, her pregnancy. At first, I didn't fully grasp the situation. I thought maybe she was just informing me, sharing some life update that had nothing to do with me. But as the weeks unfolded, her messages became more frequent and more pointed. Haley wasn't just telling me she was pregnant, she was actively trying to recruit me into her new reality. She began sending me ultrasound photos, accompanied by sentimental notes about how our son deserved a sibling who had a stable father figure in his life. Then came the photos of our son wearing a Big Brother-to-be shirt, the implication clear. She wanted me to step into the role of father for this unborn child. Her messages became increasingly desperate as the weeks passed. She sent me old baby pictures of our son, juxtaposing them with ultrasound scans and talking about how this baby could be a mini version of him. She wove together an emotional narrative, trying to convince me that it would be cruel for one child to have the love and support of a dad while the other was rejected. She appealed to my sense of fairness, of responsibility, framing it as though I had some kind of moral obligation to step in and take on this new role. But I wasn't swayed. As much as I sympathized with the baby's situation and innocent life caught in the chaos of her choices, I knew this wasn't something I could take on. I had spent years extricating myself from Haley's manipulative web, fighting for the right to maintain my relationship with our son while keeping her toxic influence at arm's length. To step back into her orbit, to tie myself to her and her life even further, would be to undo everything I had worked so hard to achieve. I had to draw the line, not just for my own sanity, but for my son. He needed a father who was present and stable, not one who was constantly being dragged into drama and conflict. When I told Haley I wasn't going to raise her child, she didn't take it well. I expected resistance, but what I got was a tidal wave of emotions, pleading, guilt-tripping, and then, when that didn't work, outright anger. She accused me of being heartless, of abandoning a child who needed me, of being selfish and incapable of empathy. Her words were sharp, designed to cut deep, but I held firm. I told her what I believed to be true, that her focus needed to be on finding someone who would be good to both of her children, Someone who could step into that role willingly and with a clear heart. Alternatively, I told her she could focus on being a great mom, raising her kids with love and stability, and trust that they would be okay even without a father figure in the picture. The dynamic between us shifted dramatically after that conversation. The messages from her became less frequent but angrier, each one brimming with resentment. The same woman who had spent weeks pleading with me to take on her unborn child was now back to calling me the worst person she had ever known. She would accuse me of being a terrible father, of being selfish and immature, of failing as a man. It was as though she was cycling through every negative thing she had ever thought or said about me, determined to hurl it all at once in a last-ditch attempt to break me. Her family, of course, wasn't far behind. They took up her cause with fervor, confronting me whenever they had the chance. Whether it was a chance encounter at a school event or an orchestrated ambush during custody exchanges, they would try to shame me into compliance. Their arguments mirrored Haley's, all centered around the idea that I was condemning this unborn child to a life of rejection and hardship. The same people who had once claimed I was a terrible influence on my own son were now campaigning for me to step up as the father to a child that wasn't mine. But I knew better than to let their words get to me. I had been through this before, seen how they twisted narratives and manipulated emotions to serve their agenda. This time, I refused to engage. I kept my responses minimal, my focus squarely on my son and the life I was trying to build for the two of us. Every confrontation, every snide remark, every guilt-laden accusation, they all washed over me, leaving me untouched. Still, the situation was far from easy. Haley's desperation seemed to escalate with every passing week. The late-night phone calls started, each one filled with sobbing and pleas for me to reconsider. She would call at odd hours, her voice trembling with emotion, as she tried to convince me that I was making a mistake, that this child needed me, that I was the only one who could provide the stability her baby deserved. The calls were draining, each one chipping away at the fragile piece I had managed to carve out for myself. I started dreading the sound of my phone, the anxiety creeping in every time her name lit up my screen. One night, she called me at 3 a.m. My heart immediately went to our son. I thought something had happened to him, that he was hurt or sick. But when I answered, it wasn't about him at all. Haley was in tears, rambling about how scared she was for her unborn child, how she didn't want him to grow up without a father. It was a long, emotional plea, one that left me feeling equal parts frustrated and helpless. I reminded her, as gently but firmly as I could, that I wasn't going to change my mind. I told her that her child would never be my son, that she needed to let go of this idea and focus on moving forward. That conversation seemed to mark a turning point. The pleading stopped, replaced by anger and bitterness. Her texts became cold and venomous, each one a reminder of how much she despised me. It was a familiar cycle, one I had seen play out time and time again over the years. But this time, I didn't let it pull me under. I stood my ground, knowing that I was making the right choice for myself and my son. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for the situation. Not for Haley, her choices were her own, and she would have to live with the consequences, but for the child who hadn't asked for any of this. It wasn't his fault that his father had walked away, that his mother was scrambling to fill the void. He was innocent, caught in the middle of a storm he didn't create. But as much as I sympathized, I knew I couldn't be the one to step in. My responsibility was to my son, to ensure that his life was as stable and loving as possible. And that meant keeping firm boundaries with Haley, no matter how much she tried to blur them. After that 3 a.m. phone call, it felt like the situation had reached its breaking point. Haley's emotional manipulation had failed, and her tone had shifted from desperation to anger. It wasn't the first time I'd seen her revert to this pattern, but the intensity of her bitterness seemed to have multiplied. Each message she sent was sharper, each accusation more cutting, and each attempt to portray me as a monster more ruthless. For her, it seemed easier to villainize me than to take accountability for her choices or face the reality of her situation. Her family, ever loyal to her narrative, also ramped up their efforts. At school events, during custody exchanges, even in casual encounters in town, they never missed a chance to berate me or guilt-trip me about her unborn child. How could I be so heartless? They asked. What kind of man abandons a child in need? The hypocrisy of it all wasn't lost on me. These were the same people who once called me unfit to be a father to my own son. Now, because it suited their agenda, they were begging me to step in and take on a role I had no obligation to fill. I didn't engage. I had learned long ago that nothing I said would change their minds. To them, I would always be the scapegoat for Haley's struggles. So, I ignored their attempts to shame me. I kept my focus on my son, ensuring that he was happy, healthy, and shielded from the drama as much as possible. He was my priority, and I wasn't going to let Haley or her family derail the life I was building for him. As weeks turned into months, Haley's bitterness seemed to reach a fever pitch. Her messages became less frequent but more venomous, each one laced with insults and accusations. At one point, she even tried to claim that my refusal to step in for her unborn child somehow made me a bad father to our son. But those claims fell flat. I had built a strong, loving relationship with my son, one that couldn't be undermined by her words. He knew I was there for him, and that was all that mattered to me. Eventually, the storm began to quiet. Haley's angry texts tapered off, and her family seemed to back away, likely realizing that their efforts were futile. I wasn't going to budge, and they had no leverage to force me into compliance. I heard through the grapevine that Haley had started looking for support elsewhere, reaching out to community groups and single-parent organizations for help. Part of me felt a twinge of relief, knowing she was finally seeking resources that could actually help her instead of clinging to me as the solution to her problems. In time, Haley gave birth to her second child, a boy. I learned about it through a brief, emotionless text from her. He's here. No photos, no details, just those 2 words. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. This was her journey, one she would have to navigate on her own. For a while, things were relatively calm. Haley seemed consumed with caring for her newborn, and her focus shifted away from me. I continued to prioritize my son, cherishing the time we spent together and doing my best to provide him with stability and love. We settled into a rhythm, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like life was moving forward without the constant shadow of conflict. But the calm didn't last. A few months after her second son was born, Haley began testing boundaries again. She started dropping hints during custody exchanges, casually mentioning how hard things were as a single mom of 2. She would comment on how much my son loved his new brother, how close they were becoming, and how amazing it would be if they could grow up with the same father. I didn't take the bait. I kept our interactions short and focused, refusing to give her an opening to drag me back into her narrative. One day, though, she crossed a line. During a custody exchange, she handed me a bag of my son's belongings, and tucked inside was a framed photo of her 2 boys together. Across the bottom, in bold, colorful letters, were the words "Our Dad." It was a calculated move, designed to provoke me, to guilt me, to force me into a confrontation. But instead of reacting, I quietly handed the photo back to her. "This doesn't belong to me," I said firmly. Then I walked away. That moment seemed to be the final straw for Haley. She didn't lash out or plead. She simply stared after me, her expression a mix of frustration and defeat. It was as if she finally realized that her attempts to manipulate me weren't going to work. From that point on, she stopped pushing. The angry texts ceased, the guilt-laden remarks disappeared, and her family no longer approached me with their lectures and accusations. It was as though they had collectively decided to let it go, to accept that I wasn't going to play the role they wanted me to. In the months that followed, I focused entirely on my son. I watched him grow, celebrated his milestones, and reveled in the joy of being his father. Our bond deepened with every passing day, and I took comfort in knowing that I was giving him the love and stability he needed. He didn't ask about his half-brother often, but when he did, I kept my answers simple and honest. That's your brother, and he's part of your mom's family, I would say. But my job is to take care of you. As for Haley, she seemed to find her footing as a single mother. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had joined a support group for single parents and was getting help from community resources. It wasn't the outcome she had originally wanted, but it was the one she had to accept. Over time, our interactions became more cordial, though still distant. We spoke only when necessary, always keeping the focus on our son. It wasn't the co-parenting relationship I had once hoped for, but it was functional, and that was enough. Looking back, I felt a sense of peace with the choices I had made. I had drawn firm boundaries, protected my own well-being, and ensured that my son remained my top priority. It hadn't been easy, and there were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But in the end, I knew I had done what was right for myself, for my son, and even, in a way, for Haley. She needed to take responsibility for her own life, to stop relying on others to fix her problems, and I had given her no choice but to do that. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had also taught me invaluable lessons about strength, resilience, and the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. I knew there would be more obstacles ahead, more moments that tested my resolve. But for now, I was content, knowing that I had fought for what truly mattered and come out stronger on the other side. My son and I had each other, and that was more than enough.